My daughter was in tears. Her small hands trembled, her face flushed from crying, and her eyes filled with sorrow searched desperately for some sign of understanding. She wasn't asking for toys, she wasn't asking for gifts, she wasn't asking for anything other than something simple yet essential: respect. And in front of her, my mother-in-law stood motionless, staring with that cold, disdainful look, as if the pain of a child meant nothing, as if it were just an act, or worse, an unforgivable weakness. At that moment, while silence suffocated the room, and every gaze turned to that clash between innocence and cruelty, I knew something was about to change forever. The air felt heavy. The sound of my daughter's crying echoed like an open wound, tearing at the heart of anyone still capable of humanity. But my mother-in-law, firm in her chair, arms crossed, her mouth curled in a half-smile of irony, seemed to feed on that scene. It was as if every tear rolling down my little girl's face was a victory for her. A victory against me, against the family I had tried to build, against the idea that respect and love should be the foundation of any relationship. My husband was paralyzed, torn between the instinct to protect his daughter and the fear of confronting his own mother. I knew him well, and in that silence, I could feel his inner struggle. But my daughter could not wait for courage that came too late. Right there, in front of everyone, her childhood was being scarred in a way no wound on the body could compare to. It was a scar on the soul, in that innocent heart that could not understand why someone who should be a source of love and comfort became instead a source of fear and humiliation. I wanted to scream. I wanted to raise my voice and pour out all the venom that woman spewed upon us. But at that moment, I also knew silence was deafening, and my daughter's tears spoke louder than any words could. That scene, so simple and yet so brutal, revealed more about my mother-in-law than years of living together ever could. It revealed the hidden disdain, the need for control, the satisfaction she found in seeing someone reduced. And above all, it revealed the fragility of our family in the face of a toxic power that insisted on dominating every detail of our lives. With every tear, I remembered the times I had tried to believe things would change. The promises that my mother-in-law would be different with her granddaughter. The illusions I had built, thinking that blood ties would be enough to turn her coldness into warmth. But there, watching my daughter sob in emotional pain, all of that crumbled. There was no room left for excuses, no more naive hopes. This was the bare, cruel truth. Not only did my mother-in-law not respect us, she seemed proud of destroying everything pure and genuine. And then, as I stood to embrace my daughter, I could feel my mother-in-law's gaze drilling into me. It was as if she said, without words, asterisk, "You have no power here. I will always be above you," asterisk, but unlike what she believed, that moment did not break me. It woke me up. Because when a mother sees her daughter in tears before injustice, something inside her awakens a force that can no longer be silenced. And there, in front of everyone, amid that oppressive silence, was born the decision that would change everything. The room seemed to breathe along with my daughter's sobs. The walls held a secret no one wanted to face, but everyone could see clearly. A line had been crossed. A child should never be reduced to the point of begging for respect, and a grandmother should never be the cause of such desperate pleading. The scene was harsh, uncomfortable, almost unbearable to witness, but that is exactly what made it impossible to ignore, and perhaps that is the power of tears. They are not just signs of pain. They are silent screams that force the world to see what many pretend not to notice. My daughter crying in front of her grandmother was not just another family episode. It was the reflection of years of accumulated humiliation, of wounds hidden behind forced smiles, of silent battles fought in dark corridors. And now, everything was out in the open. Bare, exposed, impossible to sweep under the rug. In that moment, in the very instant when tears fell mercilessly, I realized that the story of our family could not continue in the same way. Something had broken, but along with the break came a new possibility, the chance to draw boundaries, to raise walls, to rebuild what had been destroyed. It was not just my daughter's tears. It was the call for transformation. And that is why I say, when my daughter cried in front of her grandmother, everything changed. Not just for her, not just for me, but for all of us. Because after that day, we would never be the same again. From the very beginning, my mother-in-law never accepted me. I remember clearly the first times I went to her house. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, not just judging my clothes, my tone of voice, or the way I sat, but as if she were dissecting my entire soul, searching for flaws she could use against me. To her, I wasn't family. I was an intruder who dared to steal the space that had always belonged to her. At first, I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was only jealousy, a temporary adjustment for a mother learning to share her son with another woman. I wanted to believe that time would soften her edges, but it didn't. The ice never melted. It grew thicker, sharper. I, the narrator of this story, have always believed in the value of family. I grew up hearing that marriage was not just between two people, but between entire families. Maybe that's why I tried harder than anyone should to win her approval. I smiled when she ignored me. I kept quiet when she criticized me. I swallowed insults that silently chipped away at my dignity. I told myself it wasn't worth starting a war, that patience was the wiser path. And so the years went by with my heart trying to stitch peace into a field of thorns. My husband, on the other hand, was always the man torn in two. An only child raised under the shadow of a mother who controlled everything, he never learned to set boundaries. To him, disagreeing with his mother felt like committing a mortal sin. I saw in him a good man, fair in many ways, but weak when it came to her. And that weakness, over time, became our greatest silent enemy. It wasn't just my mother-in-law who hurt me. It was also the complicit silence of a husband unable to stand by me when I needed him most. Then our daughter was born. With her arrival came hope, like a flame in the cold night. I thought, now everything will be different. A child always unites people. A baby melts even the hardest hearts. I believe that my mother-in-law, faced with the innocence of her granddaughter, would finally open her heart and learn to love without conditions. But that hope didn't last. From the very first months, I noticed something was wrong. My mother-in-law didn't see my daughter as her own person, full of life and innocence. She saw her as an extension of her battle with me. Every gesture of affection carried the shadow of rivalry. Every word hid a cruel comparison. My daughter, so little, grew up in an environment where she should have found warmth, but instead faced criticism disguised as advice. If she cried, my mother-in-law said it was my fault, that I didn't know how to raise her. If she smiled, she claimed it was because she had inherited her father's joy, as if I played no role at all. In her eyes, I was erased, and my daughter became an invisible battleground. The atmosphere in our family felt like walking barefoot over broken glass. Every gathering, every visit, I never knew when the next word would turn into a knife. My mother-in-law seemed to live in constant competition with me, as if the title of mother was a crown I had stolen. Any action of mine became an offense. If I cooked, she criticized the flavor. If I dressed my daughter, she said the outfit was wrong. If I spoke, she cut me off. Respect, the bare minimum of any relationship, was never present. And my daughter felt all of it. Children understand more than we imagine. She didn't know the meaning of sharp words, but she felt the tone. She couldn't name the silent war, but she carried the weight of it. And slowly that weight began to mark her heart. I saw in her eyes the confusion. How could someone who was supposed to love her unconditionally treat her with such coldness? The most painful part was seeing its reflection in myself. I, who should have been my daughter's unshakable pillar, was constantly weakened by the invisible war with my mother-in-law. My home, which should have been a refuge, had become a minefield. And in the middle of it all, my husband remained trapped, torn between blind loyalty to his mother and the duty to protect his own family. That was our reality. I was a mother struggling to protect her child and her dignity. My daughter, an innocent soul growing up under the weight of tears she should never have known. My mother-in-law, a controlling woman incapable of seeing love beyond her own pride. And my husband, the man who loved us both, but didn't know how to choose. We were a family, yes, but a broken one. A family marked by tension, rivalry, and the absence of respect. A family where love existed but was suffocated by pride and silence. And so, long before the fateful day when my daughter cried in front of her grandmother, the story was already stained with years of unhealed wounds. What happened that day was not an accident, not an isolated moment. It was the inevitable explosion of a bomb that had been ticking for years, set off by every insult, every humiliation, every complicit silence. The problem didn't happen all at once. It grew slowly, like poison spreading through the veins of our family. At first it was small comments disguised as advice. But soon the mask slipped, and the cruelty behind her words became undeniable. My mother-in-law never missed an opportunity to remind me that, in her eyes, I was unworthy. And the most painful part was that she used my daughter as her weapon of choice. She would look at my little girl and say, "She doesn't know how to behave. She's spoiled." The words cut deep, not because they were true, but because they were said with such disdain. Every time my daughter stumbled, every time she hesitated, every time she showed the innocence natural to a child, my mother-in-law twisted it into proof of my failure as a mother. "This is what happens when children are raised with too much softness," she would sneer. The implication was always the same. I was weak, incompetent, and unfit. But she never stopped there. She loved comparisons. If my daughter cried, she would tell stories of other children. When my neighbor's granddaughter was her age, she was already so well behaved. "Look at your child, always so sensitive." If my daughter laughed, she would say, "She gets that joy from her father. Certainly not from you." And each word was a carefully sharpened blade, aimed not at my daughter directly, but at me. She wanted to erase me from my own child's life, to make it seem as though every good trait came from anyone but me, and every flaw was solely my fault. Family gatherings became unbearable. In front of everyone, she would let her venom slip, always dressed as concern. She would tell my husband's relatives, "I worry about the girl. She's too fragile." Children need discipline, not this modern softness her mother insists on. And the room would grow silent because everyone could feel the hostility dripping from her words. But no one said anything. My husband sat frozen, his silence speaking louder than her insults. And I sat there too, forced to swallow my pride, to protect my daughter from scenes she was too young to understand. The humiliation was constant. There was the time I spent hours cooking for the family, only to have her push her plate away and say loudly, "This food has no flavor." In my house, meals used to taste like real cooking. Everyone looked at me, waiting for my reaction. I smiled through the sting, but inside I was breaking. There was the time she criticized my daughter's dress in front of guests, saying, "What kind of mother lets her child look like that?" My daughter lowered her head, embarrassed, too young to defend herself. I pulled her close, trying to shield her, but the damage was already done. And perhaps the cruelest moments were the quiet ones, when no one else was watching. She would lean toward me and whisper, "Your daughter deserves better. If you weren't so selfish, she wouldn't have to suffer." Those words haunted me, because even though I knew they were lies, repeated enough, they began to seep into my mind. I started to question myself, to wonder if maybe I was failing, if maybe my daughter really did deserve more than I could give. That was her greatest weapon, not just insulting me in front of others, but planting doubt in my heart. But it wasn't only me who suffered. My daughter began to sense the rejection. Children are intuitive, and she could feel the coolness in her grandmother's eyes, the way affection was always withheld, the way love was replaced with judgment. She began to withdraw, to grow quiet whenever we visited. And at home, she would ask questions that pierced me to my core. "Mom, why doesn't Grandma like me?" I would hold her and say, "She does, sweetheart. She just has a hard way of showing it." But inside, I was screaming because I knew that wasn't true. The tension in our house became unbearable. Every phone call from my mother-in-law made my chest tighten. Every family dinner felt like walking into a battlefield. And my husband, though he saw the damage, refused to take sides. "She's my mother," he would say, as if that simple fact excused everything. But motherhood does not justify cruelty. Blood does not erase poison. And yet he clung to that excuse, leaving me to stand alone. It was clear the conflict was escalating. My mother-in-law had no intention of stopping. Each humiliation, each cutting remark, each cold glance was a way for her to assert dominance, to remind me of my place in her world, beneath her. But what she didn't realize was that her war was no longer just with me, it was with my daughter. And when a child is caught in the crossfire, the stakes change completely. The problem was no longer just a strained relationship. It was a growing storm, one that threatened to break the fragile balance of our family. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before that storm erupted. Because you can only push a child so far before her tears become the undeniable truth no one can ignore. It happened on an evening that was supposed to be ordinary, a family dinner, nothing more. I had spent the whole day preparing, telling myself that maybe, just maybe, if everything was perfect, my mother-in-law would have nothing to criticize. The table was set, the food carefully cooked, and my daughter wore a little dress she loved, her hair tied in neat braids. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that the night might pass without incident. But hope is fragile, and in our house, it rarely survived my mother-in-law's presence. The evening began with tension humming beneath every word. My mother-in-law entered with her usual air of superiority, her eyes scanning the room like a queen inspecting her subjects. My husband greeted her with forced warmth, while I tried to steady my breathing. My daughter, innocent and eager, ran up to show her grandmother a picture she had drawn earlier that day. She held it out with a shy smile, her little fingers gripping the paper as though it was a treasure. "Look, Grandma," she said softly, "I made this for you." Instead of kindness, there was only cruelty. My mother-in-law glanced at the drawing, then scoffed. "This is what you call art?" At her age, children should be doing much better than this. Her words cut through the room like a knife. My daughter's smile faltered, her hands trembling as she lowered the paper. She didn't understand why something she had created with love was being dismissed so harshly. I saw her lips tremble, but she bit them, trying not to cry. Dinner continued, but the atmosphere had already cracked. Every bite of food tasted like ash in my mouth. My mother-in-law found fault in everything. Too much salt, not enough flavor. You never learn. My husband sat silent, eyes fixed on his plate, pretending not to notice. And then it happened. The spark that would ignite everything. My daughter accidentally spilled a small glass of juice. It wasn't much, just a few drops sliding across the tablecloth. But to my mother-in-law, it was the opportunity she had been waiting for. She slammed her hand against the table, her voice sharp and loud. "Useless. Can't you even sit properly? You are spoiled, careless, just like your mother." The room froze. My daughter's eyes widened, her small body stiffening under the weight of the insult. For a second, there was silence, the kind that swallows the air, making it hard to breathe. Then the tears came, first a trickle, then a flood. She covered her face with her tiny hands, her shoulders shaking as sobs tore through her chest. Her cries filled the room, raw and piercing, shattering any illusion of peace. It was as if the world itself had stopped. Forks clattered against plates, conversations died instantly, and every pair of eyes turned to her. Time slowed, and in that silence, the sound of my daughter's sobs was deafening. She wasn't just crying because of spilled juice, she was crying because her innocence had been bruised, because her heart could not bear the weight of cruelty disguised as discipline. I felt my chest tighten, my vision blur with tears I fought to hold back. My hands curled into fists beneath the table, nails digging into my palms. I wanted to leap across the room, to shield her from those words, from those eyes, from the coldness that had made her cry. My husband shifted uncomfortably, his face pale, but still he said nothing. His silence was another betrayal, another wound layered on top of my daughter's. The drawing she had made earlier still lay on the table, crumpled at the edges where her little hands had squeezed it. The innocence of that gesture, the hope of offering love, was now drowned in tears. And as my daughter cried harder, her voice breaking into hiccuped gasps, I realized that this was no longer just another insult, another passing wound. This was the moment that would define everything. No one moved. My mother-in-law sat there, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at her lips, as if the tears of a child were proof of her power. The others at the table shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, but still silent. It was unbearable, watching the people I called family sit frozen, while my daughter's heart shattered in front of them. I pulled her into my arms, pressing her face against my chest, whispering, "It's okay, it's okay," though we both knew it wasn't. Her tears soaked through my dress, hot and heavy, each one a reminder of the cruelty she had just endured. And as I held her, rocking her gently, I felt something ignite inside me. A line had been crossed that could never be undone. The sound of her sobs lingered in the air long after they began to fade, echoing through the walls, sinking into the silence. In that moment, something shifted. The family dinner was no longer about food or tradition, it was about truth. The truth that could no longer be ignored, no longer hidden behind polite smiles or forced peace. My daughter's tears had stripped away the mask, exposing the rot that lay beneath. And so, in that room filled with silence, broken only by the sobs of a child, everything changed. The respect that had been demanded but never given was shattered. The balance that had held our fragile family together was destroyed. And though no one yet realized it, the path forward had already been decided. Because those tears were not just a child's sadness, they were a revelation, a warning, and the beginning of the end of silence. The sobs of my daughter still lingered in the air like a storm refusing to pass. Her small body trembled in my arms, her face buried in my chest, and I could feel the weight of every tear soaking through my dress. For a moment, it felt as if the entire room had turned to stone. The clinking of silverware, the chatter, the forced politeness, all of it had vanished. There was only the sound of my child's cries, raw and unfiltered, echoing through the silence. And then, slowly, the silence began to turn into something else. A mirror. Everyone at that table, relatives, cousins, even friends, was forced to confront what they had always chosen to ignore. They could no longer pretend not to see the cruelty, no longer hide behind nervous laughter or polite excuses. My daughter's tears made the truth undeniable. This wasn't discipline, this wasn't guidance. It was humiliation, plain and merciless. I looked around the table, and for the first time, I saw shame in their eyes, not mine, but theirs. They shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze, avoiding the sight of my daughter's sobbing face. The mask of family harmony was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of a child's suffering. And then, the moment I had prayed for but never dared to expect finally happened. My husband, the man who had always sat silent, paralyzed between loyalty to his mother and duty to his family, pushed back his chair. The sound of the legs scraping against the floor echoed like thunder. He stood, his face pale but determined, his hands clenched at his sides. For a second, his mother stared at him in disbelief, as if certain that once again he would defend her, but not this time. "Enough," he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "This ends here. You will not hurt her again." The words hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. My mother-in-law blinked, stunned, her mouth opening to retort but finding no words. For the first time, she was stripped of her power. The weapon she had always wielded control through fear, silence, and manipulation was slipping from her hands. My husband walked to where I sat, kneeling beside me and our daughter. He rested his hand gently on the little girl's back, his eyes filled with guilt and resolve. "I should have stopped this long ago," he whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, "but I won't stay silent anymore. If you can't treat my wife and daughter with respect, you won't be welcome in this house again." The room froze. Gasps rippled around the table. No one had ever heard him speak to his mother like that. It was as if the ground itself had shifted, the impossible becoming reality in front of our eyes. And in that moment, the balance of power changed forever. My mother-in-law's face flushed red, her hands trembling as she tried to respond. You would choose them over me?" she stammered, her voice cracking with disbelief. But the question betrayed the truth. She had always expected to be chosen, always assumed her son's loyalty was hers to command. Now, for the first time, she saw that grip breaking. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. She looked around the table, searching for allies, but found only averted gazes. No one defended her. No one nodded in agreement. The same family that had once excused her behavior now saw it for what it was: cruelty, pettiness, and pride. And in that silence, her power dissolved. This was karma, not in some mystical sense, but in the simplest of ways. Cruelty always exposes itself, and when it does, respect vanishes. The woman who had spent years humiliating me, belittling me, trying to erase me, was suddenly the one who looked small. Her authority was gone, her words stripped of their sting. My daughter's sobs softened as she realized she was no longer alone. She looked up, her tear-streaked face searching for reassurance, and found it in her father's eyes. For the first time, she saw him stand between her and the storm. And in that moment, the fragile bond between father and daughter strengthened in a way that no cruelty could ever break. As for me, I held her close, watching as the woman who had tormented us sat speechless. For years, she had controlled the room, dictated the rules, silenced opposition with fear. But that night, a child's tears had undone her entire reign. She tried to regain composure, lifting her chin, forcing a bitter smile. "You're making a mistake," she said coldly, but her voice lacked the venom it once carried. The words rang hollow, empty of power. The queen had lost her throne, and everyone knew it. That was the turning point. The night when silence broke, when the truth came out, and when the balance finally shifted. For the first time, I saw a future where we didn't have to live under her shadow. And it began not with a fight, not with screams, but with the innocent tears of a child and the courage of a father who finally chose to protect what mattered most. That night, as the echoes of my daughter's sobs finally faded into silence, something inside me shifted forever. The house, once filled with the heavy air of unspoken tension, now carried a different weight, the kind that comes after a storm, when the ground is drenched, but the air feels clearer. For years, I had endured humiliation, swallowed insults, and told myself it was better to keep the peace. But I learned, in the most painful way, that peace built on silence is nothing more than submission disguised as harmony. When my daughter cried in front of her grandmother, It was as though her tears washed away every excuse, every justification, every mask. In that moment, the truth became undeniable. Respect cannot be demanded by force, nor earned through fear. Real respect is born out of love, and love is proven not in words, but in actions. That night, I understood that family is not defined by blood alone, but by the courage to protect one another when it matters most. I realized something else too, that sometimes it takes the innocence of a child to reveal the deepest truths. My daughter didn't understand manipulation, pride, or power struggles. She only knew that she wanted kindness and received cruelty instead. And when she cried, she exposed the failure of every adult in that room who had stayed silent for too long. Her tears were not weakness, they were revelation. And my husband's voice, breaking his silence at last, showed me that change is always possible. People can awaken even after years of fear and hesitation. That night, he chose to stand with us, not as a son bound by duty to his mother, but as a father and husband bound by love. That choice changed everything. It reminded me that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance for light to break through. As for my mother-in-law, she may never admit her cruelty. Pride rarely allows such honesty. But it no longer matters, because in that single night, her power over us ended. She may still be my husband's mother, my daughter's grandmother, but she is no longer the ruler of our lives. The respect she once demanded without giving was gone, replaced by silence that no longer protected her, but condemned her. And so I walked away from that night with a lesson etched into my heart, that true family is built not on control or appearances, but on compassion, loyalty, and courage. That love means standing up, even when your voice shakes, even when your legs tremble. That sometimes the most powerful truths are spoken not with words, but with tears. My daughter taught me that. She showed me that innocence has the strength to break chains that years of endurance could not. And in her eyes, red from crying, yet still filled with the light of trust, I saw the promise of something better. A family where respect is not begged for, but given freely. Where love is not conditional, but unconditional. Where no one ever has to cry just to be seen. That night changed everything. And though the scars remain, they serve as reminders of the silence I will never allow again, of the boundaries I will never let anyone cross, of the strength that can be born even from pain. Because sometimes the greatest lessons come from the smallest voices. And it was the voice of my daughter, carried through her tears, that taught me the hardest and most important truth of all: who truly loves and who only pretends to. If you've stayed with me through this story, then you know it wasn't just about a family dinner, or even about a grandmother's harsh words. It was about something deeper, the wounds that silence can cause, the strength it takes to finally speak, and the power that love carries when it chooses to protect the innocent. Stories like this aren't just mine. They belong to countless families, countless voices, countless children who have cried not because of spilled juice or silly mistakes, but because they felt unloved, unwanted, or unseen. And now I want to turn this to you. Have you ever been in a moment like this? Have you ever seen a child cry because of words that should never have been spoken? Have you ever sat at a table where love was expected, but cruelty showed up instead? If you have, then you understand the pain, the silence, the way it lingers long after the moment has passed. Tell me your story, write it in the comments. Share your truth. Do you believe my mother-in-law was wrong that night? Or do you see it differently? I want to know, because every voice matters, and sometimes healing begins when we dare to share. If this story touched you, if you felt that knot in your chest, if you saw yourself or someone you love in these words, then I ask you to take one small step. Subscribe to this channel. Not because of numbers, not because of algorithms, but because this is a space where stories like these deserve to be told. where pain can be transformed into lessons and where silence can be broken. And don't just stop there. Share this video with someone who might need it. Maybe a friend who is going through a family struggle. Maybe a parent who needs to be reminded of the weight of their words. Or maybe even someone who feels alone so they can see they're not. Because none of us should carry these burdens in isolation. And finally, if this story made you think, if it opened your eyes or touched your heart, leave a simple sign in the comments. Just write, "I understand," because sometimes those 2 words are enough to remind someone else scrolling through that they are not invisible, not forgotten, not alone. This is not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning. Because every story teaches us something new about who we are, what we allow, and how we choose to love. And if there's one thing this story has shown, it's that even tears can be powerful enough to change everything. So, what about you? Have you ever faced a moment when someone you loved had to stand up, or when you had to? Have you ever been caught in the tension between silence and truth? If so, I'd love to hear it. Share it below, and let's keep building this space together. Because respect is not just something we demand, it's something we create together. And love, real love, is never proven in silence.